a discussion of aggregate demand.
Okay.
So, sorry?
Yeah, okay.
Sure. So, firstly, I just start off with what is the current sort of mainstream view of aggregate demand, mainstream or neoclassical view of the importance of aggregate demand?
Well, I think this goes to the distinction that mainstream economists make a lot out of these days, which I think Paul Krugman calls the saltwater and the freshwater school.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember which is which.
Saltwater is more sort of more New Keynesian, I suppose. Freshwater is Chicago.
That's what I thought. Freshwater Chicago and saltwater is the New Keynesian guys, right? So this
Just
is
specify what those are in the short.
right. Well, there are two schools of thought. Basically, we have to go back to the 1970s here, when the so-called micro foundations revolution took place, where all acceptable economic modeling have to be based on some sort of utility maximizing agent. Prior to that, even the American Keynesians like Paul Samuelson had basically ignored this issue. They hadn't tried to fit macroeconomics together with microeconomics as it was generally accepted, the ideas of utility maximizing agents and so forth. Now that's an interesting discussion all on its own. It makes up part of my book because I think that's sort of a crucial moment, and you can find the weaknesses with Samuelson's American Keynesianism or neo-Keynesianism going right back. You can find that Samuelson basically ignored these issues on purpose and didn't really pay any attention to them for, well, I think it was for political reasons actually, but that's a broader discussion. But basically in the 70s, it began to become increasingly accepted that every valid macro model had to have at its base some sort of idea of utility maximizing aid. And this started off what came to be known as the rational expectations revolution and so forth. And these were basically new classical economists who said that agents always had perfect information and so on, and so markets was always clear. And so they pretty much resurrected the pre-Keynesian economic views. But the new Keynesians, beginning, I suppose, in the early 80s mainly, although there was probably a few around in the late 70s, they tried to introduce sort of imperfections into these overarching new classical models. So they kept intact the idea of a utility maximizing agent, but they imposed certain conditions where even with this construction in place, the economy wouldn't reach full employment equilibrium. And the explanations they came up with were, I'd say, either mundane or ridiculous. I mean, when you look at the more mundane side of it, you're talking about the likes of Joseph Stiglitz and George Akerlof and these people, and they did it in a fancy way, but effectively what they said is that people don't have access to perfect information, and some people have more information than others. And I think it should be stressed. I don't have a serious problem with Joe Stiglitz and Akerlof and these people. I think their heart is in the right place. But I mean, if that's what passes for a revolutionary argument, Nobel Prize winning argument in contemporary economics, then contemporary economics is a load of crap, frankly. I mean, that is a ridiculously obvious statement that any undergraduate could come up with.
Which is, I suppose, the difficulty that comes with these statements is to integrate them within the neoclassical canon, right? So it's not so much that, at least if you want the justification for the prize would be that within this framework, integrating market imperfections takes a whole lot of intellectual gymnastics, which is what I suppose would justify the prize.
Yes, but that's not really clear, is it? Because then why doesn't everyone who subsequently introduces the imperfections into the model win the prize? It's clearly the person who suggested doing it in the first place and who pioneered the approach. And their only innovation really is to have actually stated this, to have stated people can have more information than one another and access to imperfect information and so forth. I mean, information asymmetry is what they call it. But surely it's the person who introduces it first that gets all the kudos. And I've talked to mainstream economists, and they genuinely think that this is like some revolutionary insight. You know, they think it's fascinating. You know, it's an amazing intellectual leap forward. You know, I mean, I just think that if the profession has got to such a state where that sort of argument is given that much praise, then the profession is just in such a dark age that it's almost incomprehensible to anyone who doesn't move in those circles. I mean, I still find it incomprehensible that I can talk to an educated person who will tell me that saying that some people have access to more information than others is an intellectual revolution of some sort.
I agree with you in the sense that the insight itself is so banal as to be trivial. But what I suppose was the justification would be that I suppose creating an Euler equation or whatever they do with imperfect information would be a difficult task. I mean, I don't know for sure.
But I don't think it would be if you already understood if you were already building models with those aspects. It's not, I mean, you don't have
coming up with a model with those aspects in the first place.
I really don't see it. I mean, I think that if people are building the models with that level of technical sophistication, as long as you can do that, you know, you can do that. And really the award is being given for the insight. And again, I have to stress, I have spoken with mainstream economists, but young mainstream economists, graduate students and so forth, who really tell me, you know, this is such an insight. You know, this is revolutionary. You know, they really do see this as something kind of amazing. I think what happens is you get trained in thinking in perfect information terms, and then if you've been doing that for 3 or 4 years, when you encounter something that isn't doing that, it actually does have a lot of novelty. Mm-hmm. I guess it's the same case to be made that I may not find a paper hat very entertaining, but somebody who's been locked in a cage, you know, for 20 years and who's never seen a paper hat might find it far more fascinating than me. I think that's the sort of thrust of that. Mm-hmm. But so anyway, so getting back to the effective demand issue, the new Keynesian argument is generally that if you introduce these imperfections, and I said that some of them are mundane and some of them are absurd. The absurd one would be, for example, Greg Mankiw's menu cost. This is a menu cost theory. So basically, the argument is if you ran a restaurant and you wanted to change prices, that you would have to pay for the new menus, and that might be a price imperfection. I mean, if people can't see how that's not only banal, that's not only a banal argument, that's a really, really stupid argument. And like, frankly, only a stupid person could take that argument seriously. I mean, you may be mathematically sophisticated and stuff like that, but I literally would just, I don't know, I would have no time for somebody who took that argument seriously. I can't believe it's in textbooks, and it's literally an embarrassment. But so that's the other one. So basically, they have a combination of these imperfection arguments, and they say that these introduce friction, not friction so much, they introduce rigidities into the markets in the short run, but that they effectively get ironed out by market processes in the long run. Mm-hmm. Now, the short run and the long run are sort of slippery concepts. They always have been. They're not really dated generally. They're not really given any specific historical time limit. For example, the short run is not generally conceived of a year or 5 years. and the long run is not generally thought of as 10 years or 20 years. So there's sort of abstract constructions that are in a sense tautological. But I think that most mainstream theorists, again, they don't really deal with these issues most of the time, but I think most of them do carry around an idea in their head, basically, of how long the short run and the long run are. I'd imagine the short run is between 1 and 3 years or something like that, and the long run is everything afterwards. Now, people are going to have differing perspectives on that, but frankly, I think in the terms that they're casting it, it's a ridiculous argument anyway. And you'll probably find that none of them agree on it, and none of them even talk about it.
Yeah. Now, I think the short run, long run, from a sort of modern mainstream point of view, would essentially be sort of a circular argument in the sense that it is short run is when policy is effective, long run is when policy is not effective.
Yes, and that's a tautology, of course, right?
Yeah, which makes it completely arbitrary. But the thing is, it's actually better to understand what they're trying to do. The sort of, if you boil down the short run, long run argument, it comes back to the the inverted L aggregate supply curve that we talked about last time.
Oh, what do you mean?
Oh, in terms of, in the short run, factors are not at full employment, and you can bid prices up and so on and so forth.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was the
This is actually a post-Keynesian construction. Like this diagram is present, I think, in the Encyclopedia of Post-Keynesian Economics by John King.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, what the new Keynesians were trying to do is, and this is where I think people should appreciate that. I think mainstream economics is basically a sort of vacuous discipline in which various political forces play. Play out their little intellectual games. And funnily enough, this is often what the mainstream will accuse heterodox people of doing. They'll say that we're Marxists and radical leftists and stuff like that. But I think this is far more true, actually, in the case of mainstream. I think that everyone is hiding behind their intellectual constructions, but they're really just stating their own particular policy preferences. So the new Keynesians, I think, were introducing these arguments, whatever you think of them, in order to justify interventionist policies in the economy. And remember, these interventionist policies that they were pushing were so non-radical at all. I mean, they were literally talking about interest rate targets. I mean, the essence of the new classical argument is that it's something like Austrianism, that a central bank shouldn't exist. I don't think any of
Austrianism is different in the sense that credit can have real effects, right? But in the new Keynesian synthesis, in the new classical, it's the idea that fiddling about with monetary policy doesn't have any real effects in the long run.
No, and then if they took the argument seriously, it would have inflationary effects, and we don't really like inflation much. So what that's the point? So that's the implication. So the new Keynesians are really only making a case for interest rate targets. I mean, up until recently, obviously since the crisis, they've been scrambling.
Yeah, liquidity trap and so on. You can move.
What Paul Krugman calls the liquidity trap, which I document quite clearly, not a liquidity trap, and in fact, his argument doesn't make any sense and unarticulated and mysterious. But if you actually dig into it, but without going into that too much, for years and years, what these Keynesians were trying to do was justify monetary policy intervention. So this is something that central banks were doing anyway. It's almost crazy in a way how narrow the debate became, because on the radical fringes of the mainstream, the theorists were trying to justify what was being done in the real world anyway. And then everyone else was denying this and seeing this as some sort of a radical innovation. Literally, the clowns took over the circus in the past 40 years. I think this will be adequately appreciated in the future, but I don't think enough people understand it now.
Sure.
But so basically their argument is that effective demand does matter in the short run, that this effective demand can be managed through interest rate manipulation.
But the idea is that demand is the failures of demand arise from market imperfections, which are price rigidities, sticky prices in the short run, sticky wages, as well as essentially what is an interest rate, a sort of an interest rate price ceiling, right? Which is what the Paul Krugman articulates the liquidity trap is.
Yeah, and what they're all, the unstated assumption lying behind all of this, all the New Keynesian literature, is that there exists what's called a natural rate of interest, which goes back to
Vixel.
And to the earlier work of Keynes. And this is the idea that that there's an interest. Again, the New Keynesians don't articulate it properly because they're so distracted with their own constructions. But the idea is that there is an interest rate where the central bank can set the price where it will generate full employment and price stability.
Sure. So yeah, so it's a price where the supply of credit throughout the whole economy and the demand for credit will equilibrate. That's the natural rate of interest.
That's the natural rate of interest. And if you want to get technical about it, what it actually means is that you try and equalize the interest rate with the how should I call it, the real or natural profit rate on real capital.
Mm-hmm.
So that ensures that no overinvestment takes place, which would cause inflation, and no underinvestment takes place, which would cause unemployment and crowd deflation.
Right. But the new classicals effectively, I mean, to the extent they talk about this, they implicitly assume that the economy, the interest rate is there anyways, unless
Yes,
fiddled with.
Exactly, and that the economy should be able to tend towards the natural rate itself. Now, this is also the argument I should point out by Austrian economists, and I think if you dig into it, Austrians, when they're being honest with themselves, are basically neoclassicals. They talk uncertainty and radical uncertainty. Well, they talk about it when it suits them, not when it doesn't. And so
and there's praxeology, which is its own can of worms.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty much overlaps with new classical economics, just less formalized. But yes, the new classicals are effectively saying that there'll be the natural rate of interest will be achieved by the market, while the new Keynesians are introducing various imperfections that require that the monetary authority tries to find the natural rate themselves. Mm-hmm. And the general way in which this is conceived to be done is through, which is a construction that shows how a central bank should go about achieving this natural rate, although the Taylor rule itself is based on tautology, and so there's all these mysterious debates about how to estimate the natural rate, which frankly are ridiculous. They're pretty silly. They're impractical and pretty silly. And frankly, I don't think any central bank in the world is operating using a Taylor rule, or I don't think even most central bankers are conceiving of themselves in terms of hitting a natural rate. I think they're more pragmatic than that.
Yeah. Before we get into the liquidity trap and the post-Keynesian response to this, I just want to read out a quote from Paul Krugman, who's sort of, I suppose you could say he's the most prominent advocate of new Keynesianism. Would you say that would be fair?
I think that's very fair. And I also would add to that I think that Paul Krugman, in the way that he's changed his opinions after 2008, is reflective of how new Keynesianism will evolve moving into the future.
Mm-hmm. Right. So what he says is, the brand of economics I use in my daily work, the brand that I still consider by far the most reasonable approach out there, was largely established by Paul Samuelson back in 1948, when he published the first edition of his classic textbook. It's an approach that combines the grand tradition of microeconomics, with its emphasis on how the invisible hand of the market leads to generally desirable outcomes, with Keynesian macroeconomics, which emphasizes the way the economy can develop magneto trouble, requiring policy intervention. In the Samuelsonian synthesis, one must count on the government to ensure more or less full employment. Only once that can be taken as given do the usual virtues of free markets come to the fore. It's a deeply reasonable approach, but it's also intellectually unstable. For it requires some strategic inconsistency in how you think about the economy. When you're doing micro, you assume rational individuals and rapidly clearing markets. When you're doing macro, frictions and ad hoc behavioral assumptions are necessary. So what? Inconsistency in the pursuit of useful guidance is no vice. The map is not the territory, and it's okay to use different kinds of maps depending on what you're trying to accomplish. If you're driving, a road map suffices. If you're going hiking, you really need a topo.
Well, I think that's fairly indicative, and you find very similar statements from Samuelson.
I felt this was the clearest possible articulation of what they think they're doing.
Which is effectively, we don't know what we're doing, I think.
Strategic inconsistency was particularly hilarious.
And also, I think you should note that there's a very heavy political tone in what Krugman is saying. And this is a case that I try and make in my book, that the new Keynesian and neo-Keynesian synthesis, I'm more so focused on the neo-Keynesian synthesis, but you can say the same for the new Keynesian synthesis. These are politically motivated ideologies. I should be really clear about that. Now, because a lot of heterodox economists tend to be center-left leaning sort of people, they don't point this out enough. But I think it does need to be said. Just because you may have sympathy with the politics of somebody like Krugman, which I do to some extent on some issues, does not mean that we should allow him to get away with what is effectively a political argument masking as a logical argument. Mm-hmm. He's being quite clear there. I mean, even in the words he's using. Samuelson said this explicitly. Samuelson, in an interview in the late 1980s, which I quote from extensively in my book, said that he found Keynesian economics to be inconsistent in the late 1930s, but with what he had learned in Chicago in terms of micro and so forth. And he literally said, I'm paraphrasing, but this is almost an exact quote, why would I dwell on these inconsistencies when I had a doctrine in my back pocket which allowed me to support Roosevelt and his policy? I mean, that is a huge admission. I mean, this needs to be focused on more. Mm-hmm. This is a seriously politically motivated, immediately politically motivated form of intellectual theorizing. And Paul Krugman, I think, is doing the same thing. He's not being as explicit as Samuelson. But listen to the tone of what he's saying. He's saying that free markets will work when the government intervenes, but the government has to intervene to maintain a level of full employment. Well, that sounds to me like a political position, not an economic position. That doesn't sound to me like economic policy. That sounds to me like a political pitch and something that a politician would say to you rather than a social scientist, frankly. Sure. And I think that this needs to be really driven home because then people often come back to me and say, hey Phil, you like a lot of the same policies as Krugman likes. Well, not all of them. I think Krugman's arguments on free trade need to be pointed out more, for example. But even if that were true,
certainly what he's known for in the public, right, in terms of fiscal stimulus and so on and so forth.
What he's known for today. Remember that Paul Krugman,
in the 90s,
championing free trade in the 1990s. Uh-huh. So, my case is, if you want to make this political, which I do not think we should do, I think that we should be able to have these arguments logically without reference to politics. But if we want to make this political, then, center-left economists really want to take a closer look at what these guys were advocating in the 1990s.
Sure.
Okay, so Paul Krugman was advocating NAFTA and so forth. And to give another example of somebody who seems to get a bit of air on this on the internet, Brad DeLong, right? He was co-authoring papers on financial markets with Larry Summers in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. We have to recall that these, and I'm not just saying, we should attack them for their politics back then. What I'm saying is, whatever theories they held told them that NAFTA was a good idea, which it turned out, I think the consensus now is that NAFTA did not eliminate the U.S. trade deficit, as was said to happen. It exacerbated it. It probably contributed to the problems with Mexican drug gangs that are plaguing the U.S. and Mexico at the moment. And it contributed to all sorts of these things. So I think the general consensus now is that either NAFTA didn't work or it didn't work very well, or it completely broke the system. And certainly Larry Summers' style policy under the Clinton administration was a main precipitating factor in 2008. So if these guys' theoretical constructions are leading to such errors, and I think this is what we need to focus on, not so much the politics of the issue, not so much the politics of free trade or the politics of financial deregulation, but their effects. I mean, if these theories were telling you one thing, for example, that free trade NAFTA would help eliminate the U.S. trade deficit, and that financial deregulation would lead to more efficient financial markets and better allocation of credit. These are empirical statements. These don't need to have any political overtones to them. We have a test, right? So I think this is where people need to really push. Don't be fooled by somebody agreeing with your politics. That's way too easy. The economics should actually, although I'm very keen to say that you can never make an economic judgment that is non-political. Pure economic theory can be completely divorced from politics.
And what we've talked about here is very much political, but I feel we have tried as best we can to not so much separate as much as make it clear that there are certain, this is less problematic when we're talking about methodology.
Of course it is, but I think these are more interesting.
They don't talk about methodology.
No, and these are more interesting discussions to have than who supports fiscal stimulus or not. Because, I mean, come on, the IMF supports fiscal stimulus.
Yep.
It's a consensus view. Yes, it looks sort of radical or whatever because governments aren't supporting it and because governments are in such trouble. But this is just a lag. These governments aren't supporting it because of a sort of a policy lag here. The consensus view today among serious people is for fiscal stimulus and for financial regulation and so forth. We don't need to. I mean, we should continue to discuss these things in the public forum, but as far as behind the scenes go, these are not things to be discussed. These are not interesting.
Right. So we're going to get to Brad DeLong later. I've got a particularly interesting couple of quotes from him. But Krugman has recently engaged, he's engaged to some extent over the past year with the heterodox economists. But considering that we're going to talk next about the post-Keynesian theory of the interest rate and the role of effective demand in the short and the long run, it's best to lead in with Thomas Pally, who I know you're not entirely warm towards, but
Thomas Pally's a friend.
Sorry?
I correspond with Thomas Pally all the time. So I don't know where you got that idea.
Well, no, in terms of your criticism of him being a neo-Keynesian.
That was me being slightly rhetorical because he was judging MMT based on he said, where's your model and why can't you produce a static comparative statics model? And I was just pointing out that if this was a serious criticism, then he would also be criticizing about 80% of post-Keynesian work done, which does not use static modeling. Sure. No, I just thought MMT can be a little bit of a contentious issue. I'd largely support what those guys are doing. I think they're mostly right. And the way that they're trying to change it, it's very appreciable. So that's just a sort of an internal debate and me being rhetorical. But I'm regularly promoting Tom Paley's asset-based reserve requirement proposal in the media, and I think Tom Paley's a fantastic economist.
Sure.
I just think that he and a few others within the post-Keynesian camp need to chill out a bit on MMT.
Sure. Right. So, as you know, Krugman recently had a quote-unquote discussion of two back and forth with Pally. So there's a quote from Pally and then Krugman responds. The essence of Keynes's economics was the liquidity preference theory of interest rates and rejection of the claim that price and nominal wage flexibility would ensure full employment. New Keynesians abandoned both. They replaced liquidity preference theory with loanable funds interest rate theory, and they used price and nominal wage rigidity to explain cyclical unemployment. This is Pally's quote and then Krugman's response. My reaction was, what? New Keynesians assert, as Keynes did, although I don't think it matters for this debate what he said, that both liquidity preference and loanable funds are true. There are conditions under which one or the other is the main one to focus on. At full employment, loanable funds are crucial. That's the savings and investment we talked about. In a liquidity trap, liquidity preference. But no modern Keynesian, new or paleo, as he calls himself, paleo Keynesian, we can get into that later, forgets about the importance of liquidity preference.
Well, I don't think that Krugman understands what a liquidity trap is or what liquidity trap is.
Exactly. So yeah, because this was the closest possible interaction with the post-Keynesian point of view that he's had, or at least on this thing.
Yeah, we can make a broader point here, right?
Yeah, exactly. That was the intent. Yeah,
people like Paul Krugman. Remember, Paul Krugman's not young anymore. I'm not going after the old users or anything like that. But Paul Krugman's not very young anymore. A lot of these Krugman-esque economists, sort of, I don't know, new Keynesians, neo-Keynesians, call them what you want.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to learn any of this stuff. They don't understand that. They did not engage with the debate. They took Hicks's Hicks's interpretation of the liquidity trap at face value. They took it at face value when they were in their 20s, and they never looked back. The liquidity trap and the liquidity preference theory in Keynes has an absolutely enormous literature that began with the general theory, but you can already find parts of it in treatises on money.
Mm-hmm.
And it ran for years and years. There's papers by Joan Robinson, like The Rate of Interest, other essays. GLS Shackle did absolutely excellent work on liquidity preference. There's reams of material on this, and it's a very, very complex issue. Some post-Keynesians don't even think that liquidity preference matters, but I think they're absolutely wrong on that.
Sure.
That endogenous money overturns any need for liquidity preference. I totally disagree with that. But I think again, my view there would be the consensus view of post-Keynesian.
Sure. So I just wanted to get into what both of these things are. So loanable funds, as far as I understand it, was the thing we talked about before in terms of savings and investment equilibrating for a natural to form a natural rate of interest in theory, and then you can deviate from that to cause booms and slumps and so on and so forth. But then loanable funds is important because what you call classicals often use loanable funds to make arguments for crowding out. That's to say, fiscal stimulus is a bad thing because when when the government borrows, you're taking resources away from private individuals, and so the interest rate goes up, and bad things happen.
Yeah, I think that's it. So if you want a very sort of succinct history of loanable funds used to mean what it said. There was a sort of a pool of loanable funds, and there was an actual quantity restriction on the amount of money being produced. Mm-hmm. Due to the criticisms in the 19th century over that from the banking school and so forth, that credit creation was effectively it could go on infinitely, and money was largely endogenous. Wicksell tried to, quite explicitly, he says so in his book Interest in Prices, to save the loanable funds theory and allow it to overlap with some sort of conception of money being endogenous rather than sort of a fixed stock of money. And that's where you get the idea that you get a natural rate of interest at which loans for investment and savings balance each other out so that the economy can be saving just enough resources for the investment, and then there's full employment without inflation.
Sure. There's just some really important point that you've made. What I see as your point is that endogenous money, the idea that what do you call the money in some sense for the banking through private banking expands and contracts. I know this is sort of simplistic with the economy itself, right, and makes sort of invalidates loanable funds, because determining the quantity of loanable funds as you do on the supply and demand diagram becomes meaningless.
Yes, but what Wicksell is saying is he's trying to convert a quantity argument into a price argument.
Sure.
So whereas the idea of a fixed quantity of loanable money becomes meaningless after Wicksell. I should just add that the monitor has resurrected this, but since we're not talking about them, the idea of a quantity theory became invalid. But Wicksell was trying to find a price equivalent. So what he was trying to do is find a price which will equilibrate the demand for savings with the supply of savings. Right. That's fully natural rate of interest. So his idea was that, hey, although it's true that in a modern banking system, we don't have a fixed quantity of money, nevertheless, there will be an equilibrium price at which savings and investment are balanced at full employment.
According to Wicksell.
Well, that's Wicksell's argument, and that's also Keynes' argument in the Treatise on Money.
Mm-hmm. And this creates a natural rate of interest.
That price is the natural rate of interest,
yeah.
and that, most specifically, that price is the profit return on productive capital equipment.
Right. So, but the problem with the loanable funds theory, as I see it, is that it doesn't take into account expectations and uncertainty, which are the key components in in a capitalist economy. This seems to me to be Keynes's point in the general theory, which leads us into liquidity preference.
Exactly, and that's what liquidity preference is really all about. It's about introducing expectations into the formation of the interest rate. Mm-hmm. So, what I argue in my book, I also argue it in a paper that I'm presenting at a conference this September, which hopefully will be published before my book, is that what the modern version of the loanable funds theory, the Wicksell version, the version that the new Keynesians generally are using, I'm not saying all of them use it, Krugman does use it, it's in his textbook with Robin Wells, but this conception is actually reliant, although it doesn't articulate it, on some sort of efficient markets hypothesis. Mm-hmm. It's reliant on some idea that financial markets set interest rates, set prices in accordance with perfectly known information, no uncertainty, and so forth. And that's on both sides of the argument. So mm-hmm. If I'm a lender, I have to be able to tell with perfect information or with objective probabilistic information, which amounts to the same thing. I have to be able to tell how risky your investment is, right? Mm-hmm. I need to be able to tell that to be able to form a rational basis on which I can set the interest rate on my loan. At the same time, you as an investor need an objective probability measure, or what amounts to the same thing, perfect information, on the investment that you're making in real capital goods equipment, mm-hmm. right? Now, those two sides of the argument, side on the lender's side, where he puts the interest rate perfectly in line with rational expectations, perfect information, is how you abolish liquidity preference. Mm-hmm. So liquidity preference is the other conception of that, where, well, lender doesn't really know. It's an uncertain future. He doesn't know what's going to happen with the person's investment. He doesn't know where the economy is going to be in 5 years. Uncertainty, right? And then the interest rate has to be set in line with some sort of expectations on his part. On the other hand, when we're talking about you actually making your investment in real capital goods, again, we have to recognize, the Post-Keynesians recognize that is an uncertain outlay of money, and so that's reliant on your what Keynes calls animal spirits. Mm-hmm. So those two things are the two sides of the same coin, as it were. Liquidity preference determines interest rates based on expectations within the market for money, and animal spirits determines the drive that the investors have to engage in investment. Mm-hmm. So that's an entirely different conception from the one that the Wicksell and the new Keynesians and so forth are worked on. Mm-hmm. And I should say with that conception, there's how is there any guarantee that something like a natural rate of interest just can't be said to exist?
Sure.
I mean, except as some sort of a spectral entity in a pure thought
So
experiment.
the interest rate is kind of a variable, or it's almost kind of an, if you take the confidence and uncertainty argument seriously, it almost seems like kind of an undefined variable in an open system. It's not exactly that, because there are loads of interest rates and so on and so forth, but the interest rate as conceived of by Vixel.
Well, okay, so first we have to distinguish to try and bring it back down to reality a little bit. Obviously, no one is debating that the central bank sets the overnight interest rate today, right?
Right.
But all their interest rates have to be kind of stacked on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
And the spread between the central bank rate of interest and the market rate of interest for any given market will be based on the expectations of lenders, investors within that market.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that spread that is subject to complete uncertainty, I suppose you'd say.
Sure.
And then on the other side, as I said, even when we have that price set, which is set in line with expectations in the financial market, then all the real investors have to come and borrow at that rate and invest. And that, again, is not subject to rational calculation. It's subject to what Keynes called the marginal efficiency of capital, which is an idea, subjective valuation formed by investors at any given moment in time, about when it's good to invest and when it's not good to invest.
So yeah, so I mean, at least in basic economics textbooks, the marginal efficiency of capital for me was expressed as the elasticity of the response of the quantity of investment to a change in interest rate. So essentially, if confidence was low, the demand for demand for loanable funds would become horizontal, which means that if you decrease the interest rate, not many people will respond in terms of borrowing more. But anyways, that's kind of a. But what I really wanted to ask in terms of what you've said here. So in the Vixelian theory, both on the lender side and on the borrower side, you're looking at an objective assessment of the rate of return and the rate of return on capital, right? So you're from the lender side, there's the assessment of the rate of return. On the borrower side, there's a cost-benefit analysis of whether I should borrow or whether I should not borrow. In the Keynesian liquidity preference view, you change this in terms of both people's assessment is affected by expectations as well, and animal spirits, confidence, the state of the economy, mass psychology, and so on and so forth, as well as the need to get liquid.
Well, liquidity preference, the way I put it, is the flip side of the coin to, I suppose, animal spirits, right?
Mm-hmm.
So liquidity preference is, and just to define for people who don't know, it's the holding of money or money substitutes rather than risky bonds, which have intel risk. What it does is it reflects the level of uncertainty. Like,
right.
So a mainstream economist said to me recently, "Oh, Phil, this is very nice in theory, but you can't. This is a non-measurable entity. This liquidity preference. You can't measure it at all. You're just talking rubbish." And this is hugely ironic coming from somebody who implicitly supports the natural rate of interest. But you can measure this. Of course, you can measure it. There's various ways to measure it. You can see how much money investors are holding at any given moment in time. You can also, my favorite measure of liquidity preference right now is called the TED spread.
Yeah.
It's spread between 3-month treasury bills and the LIBOR rate. And this rests on the argument, which by the way is not in Keynes, but this is for institutional reasons and because the banking system hadn't developed to the extent that it has now. But now, 3-month treasury bills are pretty much seen as money substitutes. 3-year US Treasury bills and UK Treasury bills and so on. These are generally seen as perfect money substitutes that earn a little bit of interest, right? And this is actually something that the MMT guys have pointed out, and I think more people need to take on board. It's not integrated into post-Keynesian theory properly. These are seen as effective money substitutes. So if you look at the spread between the 3-month bill rate, Treasury bill rate, and the LIBOR rate, you can quite clearly see it's like a graph, and every time that graph spikes, you're entering something of a liquidity drop. And this is what everyone in financial markets likes.
Well, Krugman used the TED spread graph as well to come up with the same statement, but I understand there's different logic behind that. I mean, he used it as a measure of financial stress rather than as a liquidity preference as you articulated.
Keynes did.
No, Krugman.
Yeah, well, Krugman, I don't think has a firm definition of what he's talking about. I think he's talking about. He says that in line with John Hicks in the ISLM argument, he says that liquidity trap is when the demand for money becomes infinitely elastic, right?
Uh-huh.
Now that's contentious in itself, but then Krugman goes on to say that, for example, the U.S. economy has been in a liquidity trap for 2008.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's just not correct. There was a liquidity trap in the U.S. economy between 2008 and 2009, 2010, and there you saw a massive rush into money and money substitutes, and you see that in the spike in the TED spread.
Right.
But then the Federal Reserve stepped in and engaged in massive asset buying programs, quantitative easing. So, right?
It satisfied people's demand for liquidity.
It absolutely did, and on any realistic and coherent definition of the liquidity trap, the U.S. exited their liquidity trap in late 2009. The TED spread leveled off. Interest rates on every asset across the economy began to fall, and we're in our current environment of very, very low interest rates across all interest classes. Like even junk bonds are just idling, like so low. So Krugman doesn't. I really suspect that Krugman doesn't actually have a coherent definition of a liquidity trap. He has an idea in his head that it's when the demand for money becomes infinitely elastic, but either he doesn't know what that means or he hasn't looked at the data. But for some reason, this is gaining currency in contemporary popular debate. Sure. Probably because of the status of the people saying it rather than the content.
Well, it's because people conflate a lot of things, right? Like in terms of, they're conflating a liquidity trap with the idea of an economy operating below full employment.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, and sort of the entire argument for fiscal stimulus is caught up under this one banner, whether it should be or should not, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. I just don't think that the argument is coherent and stands on its own. And we have to remember that when Hicks came up with the argument in 1937, if you look at the Keynesian literature, outside of the sort of oversimplified American Keynesians like Samuelson and so forth, no one took Hicks's definition seriously. I mean, you look at the real literature on even Hicks himself in his later writing. Like liquidity preference has a quite clear definition, and it's the one that I'm giving you right now.
Sure.
Yeah, the people rush out of bonds and stocks and so forth, basically out of financial markets in general, and into money and money substitutes, and thus interest rates go up. This is an absolute key component. In order to be in a liquidity trap, interest rates have to be right. Okay, it's really simple, and that even entails from Krugman's own definition. When the demand for money becomes infinitely elastic, well, that means that a lot of people are rushing into money, right? And that interest rates should go up.
Right.
Interest rates did go up in 2008, 2009 when there was a liquidity drop, but everyone knows interest rates. That's what we call a zero interest rate environment. So what he's saying is just not even coherent. But this speaks to a larger issue of the American neo-Keynesian school, that it's not a coherent doctrine. I mean, you don't just have to attack this from the point of view of sort of the capital controversies or re-switching or any of these. They're trying to pick a logical emphasis. That's all well and good. But my case is much more simple. That these guys on a day-to-day basis do not know what they're talking about. That they use words that they either don't know the meaning of, or they've structured meanings that are not internally consistent with themselves. And that these are far more important issues than, for example, defining capital, because these are the things that people are going around and talking about in the real world, and actually introducing a fog of complete confusion into the debate.
Right. I don't think you deny that there is some objective assessment involved. You're simply saying that confidence plays a role in that quote-unquote objective assessment, right? You have to make some risk judgment.
But I don't think you can make an objective, a really objective numerical assessment of risk moving into
well, not numerically, but there's some, in terms of, Greece hasn't had a budget surplus for about 15 years, so you can't expect to get a decent return on your money or whatever.
Well, that's not quite how the bond market in Greece works, and a lot of people are making a killing out of moving into Greece at the moment. But the
Yeah, but in terms of you
I
get
think it's not like there's no guideposts to understand the markets is that they're largely self-fulfilling, and so almost the objective issues that you're talking about matter less than the expectation. Because the way I put it is that if you can, the Greece example is not a good one because the ECB standing took the Greece example prior to the ECB. You could make a case that there's a sort of objective make an assessment, but at the end of the day, even if the assessment is wrong and everyone believes it, the effect will be the same. I mean, take a concrete example of the interest rates. I mean, the rates were very low. The assessment, it would be because
there you go.
Okay, so I think I got cut off there, so I'll just kind of start again on the expectations issue. The key to how financial markets set interest rates and set prices on various assets there is an external objective reference point, being the real world and contemporary events within the real world. But my argument is, and I think most Post-Keynesians would agree with this, it's less the objective circumstances than the dominant beliefs about those objective circumstances. So we can take a very concrete example of these in mortgage-backed securities prior to 2008. Mortgage-backed securities were supposed to be AAA rated. They had a fairly low interest rate, but it was higher than a money substitute or a treasury bill. And so, but we know that the objective risk of those products was enormous, right? And frankly, I mean, it sort of baffles the mind that people didn't see this, that a lot of these, ninja loans and fraudulent loans and so forth that underlay these assets, I mean, if you dug into it, this should have been obvious, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not even a case where you could make a sort of Stiglitz asymmetric information argument. I mean, these people didn't notice the objective risks of the assets that they were buying because they just wanted to remain ignorant of it. Sure. And what this shows really clearly is that the expectation and maybe the institutional norms within a market are far more important than the underlying objective reality of that one. Mm-hmm. And I think this has to be stressed time again, that most financial analysts aren't really, this is pure Keynes, this is the beauty contest of Keynes. Most of the analysts aren't making calls based on the objective real events going on in the real economy. They're making calls based on what they think other people are making calls on. And there's a feedback loop, and it's completely intersubjective, and that's how it works. And any good financier knows that this is how it works.
So there's quote unquote empirical evidence.
Well, yeah, of course there is. Okay, I can give a good example. There's the Soros breaking the Bank of England in 1992. There's a recent interview with Rob Johnson, who was the senior currency economist working for Soros at the time, on the Real News Network, and he gives an account of this, and they had objective information, which was how much reserves, foreign currency reserves, the Bank of England possessed. They also had some not objective but subjective information about Germany and how, if they would step in to help the Bank of England or not, maintain the currency peg to the European exchange rate mechanism. Mm-hmm. That wasn't objective. That was a subjective valuation of what Germany were going to do. So first of all, we have to take that into account. Even at the level of objective, real world information, you're already dealing with what you think other people are going to do in response to a given action, right? Which is not something you can objectively define. I mean, you can make a better or worse judgment about that, but it's not something objective. It's something that's hardly subjective. But then even beyond that, Soros and Johnson and these have to determine to what extent they'd have to start selling sterling into the market in order to produce a bandwagon effect, where investors began to believe in Soros' bet and try and get on board. And that itself would push the Humpty Dumpty off the wall, right? Mm-hmm. So even there, you see that there's so much subjective valuation there. And what Soros and Johnson and their fund was trying to do was to build a fashion of selling the Bank of England, or selling sterling, right? They were trying to literally create a trend to sell the sterling. And in order to do that, they utilized the very large capital resources they had in Soros' fund, but they also used Soros' public figure, right?
Sure.
And out of that, Soros became sort of the arch speculator. But he needed to do that. He needed to very publicly say what he was doing and then produce a bandwagon effect and a fashion in the market. And so financial markets, when looked at from that perspective, they far more so resemble something that you might find in the fashion supplement of the Sunday newspaper. You know, these very arbitrary fashions that take place because dominant figures say they should. Mm-hmm. They very much so more resemble that than some sort of group of people making rational calculations. Now, that's not to say that a great deal of the markets are not taken up with what I call bean counters, who are people who are trying to do these objective calculations based on past trends.
And they're doing these objective calculations within this subjective framework that's set by the rest of the market.
Exactly. And so the dominant figures within the market set trends within the market, and then all the bean counters try to follow.
This reminds me. Sorry, go ahead.
You cannot reduce this to something like perfect information or like a barter market or anything like that. This is what it is, and all the important events that take place in financial markets are due to these subjective evaluation bandwagon effects. You cannot even approximate these markets in an interesting way by talking about them in terms of perfect information economy or market.
Sure. No, I mean, what do you call? It's definitely true. See, it reminds me of that saying where, you know, if you owe the bank, let's say 100, you're in trouble. But if you owe the bank 1 million, it's the bank which is in trouble.
Yes, that would be another instance of why this cannot be understood in the terms that it's cast in mainstream financial theory. But even that argument, you know, I could counter it as a good mainstream economist and say, well, you've got a problem with monopoly there, right? You've got a problem with monopoly, and if you got rid of that monopoly, then you wouldn't have that problem because the market will be competitive. What I'm saying is different. I'm saying that the market requires these trends and fashions in order to exist.
But the thing is, many of the anti-monopoly arguments ignore the necessity of monopoly, because in more ways, if you try antitrust regulations in sort of markets, they fail because in some cases you need the monopoly there. Maybe not necessarily in banking, but in other markets you need the monopoly there to provide, you know, economies of scale.
Of course, I mean that's completely obvious, but
yeah.
It should be obvious to any of the main, and this is why Post-Keynesians take monopoly or oligopolistic markets as a given, right? Mm-hmm. And that theory should be done. You shouldn't be building from a guy building cars in his shed and then, you know, confronting mainstream automotive industries. That's ridiculous. You start from what exists, and then you assume that the guy building the car in his shed is an outlier, and he's the special case. Monopoly's not the special case. The man in the shed is the special case. But I agree with you on that, and that's a different issue. Should we be conceiving of the economy as a whole in terms of perfectly competitive markets, and then lashing on a few monopoly imperfections, which I agree is not the way to proceed at all. It's a silly. But this even goes beyond that. You know, the issue of financial markets is that you just cannot use the market analogy. It's not that. The whole thing is based on expectation. And central banks know this. This is why they say that the central banks, and Krugman says this, the central banks have to be credible, right? I mean, what does that mean in a world of perfect information?
Affect their expectations.
But what does credible mean in a world of... Credible is presumably that you're trying to persuade somebody or something, right? Mm-hmm. But why would you need to persuade anyone of anything if markets operated in line with objective information? Mm-hmm. You wouldn't need to persuade, would you?
I suppose you would need to persuade in the sense that you're not going to change unexpectedly any variable in a perfect calculation.
Okay. I suppose you can make a case in that direction.
But that's just not true. In terms of the conception of central banks as doing that, that's just not what they do. It's not... They calm things in a way which would be much more conducive to the expectations view than to this view of quote-unquote irresponsibility.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm getting at. So you can attack this from pretty much any angle, and you'll see time and again the financial markets are dominated by expectations, and there's good work being done on this now. There's a guy called David Tuckett in UCL.
The anthropologist or psychologist?
He's a psychoanalyst.
Psychoanalyst, right.
And he's gone out and effectively tried to psychoanalyze the market by effectively interviewing traders in the way that a clinical psychologist would treat a patient, I suppose. Mm-hmm. And so he's really trying to get deep down into how they really form their expectations. And this is what he's finding, of course. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, it's completely obvious. You don't need David Tuckett's work. Look, I think we do need David Tuckett's work, but you don't need it. You just need to read the Financial Times, like, every day for 6 months. And if you are reading it properly, you'll understand that this is what is going on in those markets. And it's very, just as a sort of a side note, it's very entertaining for me to see David Tuckett's work come out and get such widespread recognition. For the behaviorist economists to come out and effectively try and co-opt it. Uh-huh. I think this is really dangerous because behaviorists think that they're saying the same thing, but they're not. I mean, they're two completely different approaches.
In many ways, behavioral economics is just another version of New Keynesianism, right? You're introducing frictions within an otherwise rational framework. People would make perfect decisions, but they do all these things, which is kind of flipping over the, you know what I mean?
Yes, and the key problem here is the key problem with behaviorism, right? That Freud pointed out in like the late 30s or whatever. That in behaviorism, you only judge based on what people do. You don't judge on how they conceptualize the world subjectively, because that's sort of the rule that B.F. Skinner introduced. He said, well, we can't tell anything about what's going on in somebody's head, therefore we just have to go based on the behavior. Now, that's funny because I think you can actually tell what's going on in someone's head to some extent. You talk to them. But B.F. Skinner spent more time with pigeons than with people. So he obviously didn't have a very good grasp of the people to understand to some extent what their thought processes are.
If B.F. Skinner got his theories from pigeons, one can only assume where Wilhelm Reich got his theories.
Yes, and I think there's historical evidence to suggest that what you're insinuating might be true. But what I'm saying is that the behaviorists want to get rid of any notion of imagination, subjective valuation, and
essentially deconceptualize behavior.
Yes, and I think this is really not the way to go forward in understanding financial markets. If you want to understand financial markets, you want to understand what Keynes is talking about in this beauty context, how people think about the markets themselves and how they think about those around. And that is a purely empirical issue, and can only be done by either clever people reading the financial press and noticing what's really going on, or by people like David Puckett effectively putting the markets on the couch, as it were.
But wise old traders have been saying this kind of stuff for centuries.
Oh, well, I mean, it's entirely obvious. I mean, anyone who doesn't completely lack in imagination would realize that this is what's going on in the financial market.
Yeah.
But I think the behaviorists want to adhere to some awful notion of science, you know, and so forth. But that speaks to a lot more problems. But
we talked. This is more about the scientific pretensions. That's more the last episode.
Yeah, that's more the last episode. This is a huge problem, and I'm moderating a panel later this month with David Puckett, an actual financier, an actual hedge fund manager, and then a behaviorist is saying some things at the end, and I know what that is going to look like. The financier and David Puckett are going to say something like what I've been saying, which is correct conception, and then the behaviorist is going to step in and say, oh yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. And I think it needs to be pointed out very clearly that they are doing entirely different.
Sure, right. So Perry Merling, who I'm sure you're familiar with, puts this the financial the post. What I see is a post-Keynesian view, although I suppose it is more banking school. He talks about this in terms of the liquidity panics, in terms of a pyramid of the quality of money. So showing at the top you have final money, whether that be gold, and you go down in terms of the quality of assets. So you have deposits and you have stocks and so on, and all of these fit in at some point in the pyramid. And the pyramid contracts and expands depending on where you are in the cycle. So in a boom, more people are willing to accept the lower quality credit instruments as money substitutes than they were, right? So the pyramid expands. So the credit expands because people are more willing to accept credit rather than the final means of payment, whether that be money or gold. But then in a bust, you end up having people go back to the final means of payment. They rush back to, well, get liquid. And this sort of ties together pretty neatly credit booms and busts, liquidity preference, and different financial instruments into one sort of nice little intuition.
Yeah, I mean, if you've described the theory properly, it sounds like it's certainly moving in the right direction. I just qualified that it's not so much the boom and bust cycles that matter as much as, and just also to say that is a Minskian argument that's in Minsky.
In terms of it puts Minsky with Keynes. But it's a nice way of uniting the 2 points of view.
I hope Merling is referencing Minsky and he's not one of these economists who's saying the same thing and not referencing sources, which is becoming a real issue these days.
Right.
Assuming that he is, and we can be clear that that's actually a Minsky argument, that the key component isn't the boom and bust cycle, it's the cycle of liquidity preference within the market. For example, like I said, there was a liquidity trap in 2008, 2009 in the US. The economy has remained stagnant since then, but there is no liquidity trap. So interest rates are very low within the market, and while you're talking about quality dynamics and the pyramid expanding, as it were, the pyramid is still expanding to the central bank policy. So just to make that clear, there's no necessary connection between what's going on in the real economy and what's going on in the financial market at all. That's why the liquidity preference theory, which by the way is all over Minsky's work. I don't know how people have not noticed how important it is to Minsky's argument. This is what he's saying. And yes, we can provisionally tie liquidity preference to the actual cycles in the economy, but I don't think we should do that absolutely. I think we should recognize that the 2 things are autonomous. And that's why the 2 things are not firmly tied together in Keynes.
That was actually more me than what Perry Merling kind of said was, it's a cyclical aspect, whether you talk about financial or real. It's not necessarily, no, I don't think it was real, but in terms of the quality dynamics, right? You can talk, there is a cyclical aspect obviously to financial downturns in terms of positive times and negative times.
Yeah, no,
That's all that is, I think.
well, that's the liquidity preference.
Yeah.
That's it in another guise, and I hope that listeners will appreciate that this is absolutely not what Paul Krugman is putting forward. It's absolutely not what Paul Samuelson is putting forward, and it's absolutely not what John Hicks is putting forward in the ISLM paper. Although if you read Hicks's further work on money, I think that he does ultimately understand the liquidity preference argument.
Sure. No, it's just I just like it as a tool because it allows me to think about, you know, hedge speculative and Ponzi in the Minsky terms, in terms of moving down the pyramid, which is obviously implicit in Keynes. But anyways, yeah, it's just a nice tool. But what I wanted to, sorry.
No, I didn't sound.
No, it's actually, well, what I sort of wanted to end on was the sort of discussions of Piketty, because I mean we talked about him a bit last time. Piketty, I suppose, and the distribution of income generally. We talked about him last time in terms of him becoming popular is sort of symbolic of non-econometric data work becoming more to the fore. But moving generally to the distribution of income, so what's the neoclassical view on the distribution of income?
Well, all of the mainstream adheres to the same distribution argument, which is the factors of production, which are capital and labor, are compensated in line with their marginal productivities. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the best way to summarize that in non-technical terms is, in a perfectly competitive market, capital and labor get their fair share. Now, I've seen some economists like Solov and so forth say, we don't say that they get their fair share. I think they're dancing around there. They do. The basic argument says that they get their fair share. Mm-hmm. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be unequal distribution. For example, the marginal productivity argument does not take into account that there may be, and I think readers of Piketty here will start to hear some echoes. The marginal productivity argument does not mean that there are not large stocks of wealth that are being passed down through dynasties and so forth. Mm-hmm. Right? So there's no accounting for that. If you have large stocks of wealth that have accumulated in the past and these are being passed down through the generations, then the marginal productivity will not ensure equal efficient distribution. Interestingly enough, Paul Samuelson, or was it Robert Solov? It was either Solov or Samuelson, after the Cambridge Capital controversies in the 60s, effectively said, and this was a very, I think it really showed the limited imagination of the American Keynesians. They said that, oh, well, the reason that the British are making this argument is because they live in this, class society. This is seriously what they thought. And so the American economy, the dynamic American economy, we don't have these problems. We don't have these problems. The American economy is working pretty much like an efficient market, and these dynasties don't exist here. But you guys have landed gentry in the UK. I mean, this is really what they thought. So
in terms of what you call in distribution, so large inequalities in the distribution of income, what I suppose mainstream economists would call market distorting inequalities of the distribution of income can only come about through what Stiglitz calls rent seeking or government intervention to ensure an unequal distribution of income and so on and so forth.
Something existing outside of the circuit of capital and labor. This is what's so key. That whatever they are not saying about the real existence of inequality, they are saying that the capitalist system, which brings together capital and labor in competitive profit-seeking activities, will not, on its own, generate any inefficient and unfair. And I am using the term fair because I think they're really disingenuous in saying that's not the issue here. Distribution of income, and that's what they're saying. So there's no. The conception here is one in which there is no aspect of social power. That anything that you'd find suggested in Marx does not exist at all, and I would say in every other social science. Every other social science recognizes that
whether you're quote unquote left wing or quote unquote right wing.
I think so, yeah. I think there's general consensus that distribution within the capitalist mode of production is based on, to a large extent, on social power. And yeah, I don't think I don't think that statement itself is inherently political. And I don't think that, as you said, right-wingers would largely disagree with that, outside of people in economics.
I suppose the solutions to that, or which rely on a certain interpretation of that statement, would take it more into the political arena.
Of course, but that does not make it an inherently political statement.
Yeah,
it's a statement in itself.
Reaffirming that point.
Yeah, I mean, we have to be very clear on that.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Right. Sure. No, I mean, so this is another Krugman quote on the marginal productivity theory and, Piketty and so on, which is quite useful. There are a few economists on the left who seem to believe that, one, you need to believe in the existence of a perfectly well-defined aggregate measure of capital to believe in the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. Two, if you believe in or even use marginal productivity theory, you are conceding that capitalists deserve their income. Neither of these things are true. Nothing about marginal productivity theory depends on the exact truth of a simple aggregate production function with capital defined by a single number. And saying that capital gets its marginal product in no way says that people who own that capital deserve what they get. And it's not exactly this. It's not the same quote, but it's a nice accompaniment. And what's going on here, I think, is a fairly desperate attempt to claim that the Great Recession and its aftermath somehow prove that Joan Robinson and Nicholas Caldor were right in the Cambridge controversies of the 1960s. It's a huge non sequitur, even if you think they were indeed right, brackets, which you shouldn't. But that's what seems to be happening.
Well, to address the second part of the quote first, I don't know what, I mean, I'd like to, just say, oh, it's a straw man or something like that, but where is he even getting that? Who is making the case that the Great Recession proves the re-switching argument?
Well, I suppose he's
That's absurd. How do we do that? How would we, prove the Cambridge side of, or the
The foundation of American post-war economics is kind of based on their victory in the Cambridge capital controversy, at least in growth theory terms.
And in distribution theory, which are the same thing, but yeah.
And considering that we're bringing Krugman to the point where he is acknowledging, if not the reopening of the debate, at least a reference to the idea that the debate exists, is a step forward.
Well, maybe. I mean, that remains to be seen. The debate went on for over a decade.
I'm not really implying, and I suppose I'm not really implying that I don't think we're going to convert Krugman on this, but it's definitely, at least a lot of the things that are talked about in heterodox circles are now being put in a very explicit fashion in the mainstream, a bit more than, general discussion of issues of Minsky and so on, which can be reappropriated.
Yes, but this comes back to what I said at the beginning of the last interview, that we've won. We've won the debate. It's just that people like Krugman haven't realized that they've lost. And they probably will never realize that they've lost, but they have lost. And even them, their attempt to talk about it now, which is facile. I mean, it's really facile to say that. I mean, who's claiming that the 2008 crisis proved the Cambridge UK side? Who would make that ridiculous? Only somebody who didn't understand the debate would make that argument. So,
I suppose I suppose a more charitable interpretation, or I think he could say that if the 2008 debate has reignited a debate on the distribution of income, which has reignited some form of the Cambridge view on capital. an income distribution?
Well, I mean, that's only because the mainstream view has become so untenable in light of empirical evidence to the contrary that few people are going to be suckered into believing it, right?
Sure.
And that's good, and I think that is happening. But no one is claiming that the 2008 thing proves that. That doesn't prove the debate. That's just setting a tone in what the likes of Krugman are peddling becomes very unbelievable to any reasonably minded person.
Sure. So I suppose this is difficult to do in the short time that we have left, but could you, as succinctly as possible, give a summary of the Cambridge capital controversies?
No.
No.
No. Okay. Well, I mean, it's what I said. Is distribution taking place in line with some sort of Pareto optimum efficiency condition where resources are distributed in a correct manner, or is it the case that social power plays a role in the distribution process? In technical terms, can the return on capital be defined prior to stating the distribution? And what Sraffa and Robinson were arguing is that it cannot. I mean, logically. I think that was the key. The argument took a twist and turn into re-switching and so forth, which we can go into, but I don't think it's hugely interesting. I think the key point is when we're trying to form a coherent theory, can we talk about the rate of profit or return on capital without first talking about the underlying distribution in the economy? And what Robinson and Sraffa were saying, where did I pick up?
Go on.
From where?
In terms of, you were just talking about Sraffa and Robinson and how you have to assume the current distribution of income if you want to talk about the individual factors getting their share.
Exactly. So you have to define the distribution prior to trying to conceive of anything that you could call a rate of return on capital. So distribution is prior to the everything else. So the mainstream argument is effectively that the prices of various factors of production will be set up first, and those prices will then dictate the distribution. And Robinson was saying that doesn't make any sense. You have to assume the distribution first, and then relative prices will arise out of that structure of distribution. I think that largely got lost later on in the debate when they sort of went off on the Samuelson was constructing a surrogate production function, and Sraffa was criticizing it based on the re-switching argument, which the Cambridge side, the Sraffa side of the argument was clearly correct. I mean, just logical terms. But as far as what the US side of the debate conceded in the end was that there were problems with the production function. But what the UK side of the debate was saying was far more radical than that. They were saying you cannot even begin to create a production function without first talking about the relative distributions of income.
And here you get the kind of the Caldor diagram of the wages and profits, and Kalecki diagram of wages and profits kind of derives from this idea of social conflict determining production in a very important way, and so on and so forth.
Yes, but I think it should be made clear that people who are invested in the mainstream argument are never going to become de-invested in it. It is absolutely central to the way they think about the economy. It's central to the way they teach. It's central to everything. You are not going to convince them based on a technical argument.
This changes economics from what do you call this contextualizes economics itself.
Yes, and you're not going to change their mind on this. As far as people coming to this with new eyes, with a fresh perspective, they're likely either not going to understand the intricacies of the debate, or they're not going to care. And frankly, they shouldn't care, and they shouldn't have to understand it because it's not
the intricacies of the debate, perhaps not. But I feel when talking about how economics is socially determined, starting from at least the broad bits that you've outlined is very important, because
Yeah,
this is two views of the economy, one decontextualized and one contextualized.
yeah, but I think what needs to primarily be put to people who are approaching this with fresh eyes is, do you really believe that the social power plays no role in how much return capital accumulates in the real economy? I mean, people have to be asked that, and maybe show them a graph of union membership versus inequality. It's an
Debate
absurd.
over.
Hmm?
Debate's over.
Debate should be over for any reasonable person. And so I think that's just, we just have to really appeal to people on an intuitive basis on this. We really don't need to get into the weeds on this one. And I think that if people want to debate the likes of Krugman on this, they should, and they should do so just to try and get attention, to get attention to the fact that this is a real debate. But don't expect to change their mind on this issue. What was shown in the 1960s was extremely damaging to the mainstream. I don't just mean theoretically. I mean how they viewed themselves. They viewed themselves as doing a sort of a neutral science and so forth. They also viewed themselves, especially in America, as being a sort of a bulwark against communism, and the sort of reasonable middle, as it were. And the Cambridge Capital controversy showed that a lot of this was hollow, and that what they were doing was probably motivated by other reasons, partially logical consistency, partially, again, I think, politics. And I think it's worth getting into this a little bit more. When I say politics, I don't mean that these people like Samuelson and Solov were McCarthy out red baited. I don't think that's how to read this at all. If you look into the history of it, what they're responding to is the McCarthy urge. That people like Samuelson and Solov, to form an identity as a sort of a progressive or liberal in that era, you had to understand, you had to watch a lot of people around you be purged, in effect, in the 1950s by the likes of McCarthy. You had to see this massive red scare, which was scary. I mean, it was something that we can't really conceive of today, that in America or in the UK, that because you espouse certain ideas that would be attacked in government, on television, by politicians. And it's terrifying. I mean, the McCarthy era was awful. And so people like Solov and Samuelson had to form a self-identity of this idea that you were the reasonable middle, and that you could prove that the competitive capitalist system as it existed in America was perfect, so long as the government intervened in very sort of acceptable terms, terms that were by the 60s acceptable to a mainstream American audience, and were acceptable discourse in politics. They had to form their self-identity in that way, and the marginal productivity theory allowed them to formulate that in theoretical terms. I find it very ironic that you'll see Solov, for example, in his 1987 Nobel Prize speech, saying that it was all a political issue, and that it was just the Marxist tendencies of people like Robinson and Straffa that were getting in the way here.
Never mind the Robinson disassociated with Marxists.
I think she considered herself very influenced by Marx, but she was certainly some sort of communist. But
well, she attacked a lot of Marxists as being religious, didn't she?
Yeah, what I mean as when I say the Marxist tendencies, Robinson was a communist, right? She supported Chairman Mao and so forth. So, and Straffa was probably a communist as well. So, I'm not debating the point that they were or were not communists. I just think it's completely irrelevant. There's nothing to do with anything. But what I'm saying is ironic is that they were not. I do not think the Cambridge UK side was coming at this from a political standpoint. And when you see someone like Solov or Samuelson say that, I think they're engaged in projection to a very large extent. It was them that was trying to defend the political the political truths and the political self-image that they held of themselves. I think that just has to be really driven home, and so it's going to be very difficult for mainstream economists to make the same defense today, because that Cold War mentality is broken. It doesn't exist. And if I make the arguments about capital controversies and stuff, say I'm on a panel, or a heterodox economist is on a panel, and they make this case in public, and mainstream economist has to respond, and their response is, oh, it's just politics, it's just communism. Who looks like the idiot? They look like the idiot. Mm-hmm. They clearly look like the idiot.
But this hasn't been. People have talked about it in these terms, but making an explicit reference. But the thing is, the reason I talked about Krugman talking about this is so important, because this is this sort of seminal event in both their history and the history of the heterodox.
Yeah, and why? I guess the further question is, why did the likes of Krugman subscribe to this argument so thoroughly, even though they didn't experience the same kind of political repression as Samuelson and Solov and so forth saw? I think that ties into the politics of the 1990s. The Clinton, I'm a real serious politician, i.e., I accept most of what happened under Reagan, but I'm still a liberal. This self-identity formation. I think it's so important to understand this debate. It's even reflected. What does Krugman call his column? The conscience of a liberal or whatever. He's literally making these arguments in a column called The Conscience of a Liberal. This is so tied up with political self-identity. It's not even funny. And frankly, I don't think people care about that anymore. I don't think they're tainted with those same things, and so it's going to be very difficult for the mainstream to engage in effectively dog whistle politics.
I wouldn't say. I'm very uneasy about calling the heterodox side apolitical, but I certainly think that they're able to separate the politics and the economics to the extent that the mainstream are not.
Well, that's what I'm trying to emphasize. We debate politics in this. Come to agree. Now, I think that the mainstream probably would say to themselves and so forth, but I don't believe them. I just don't believe them. I think they're way too tied up with their politics. I think the new classical monetarist types, I think they're explicitly forming their little niche in the mainstream as part of their right-wing politics, and I think that the new Keynesians and these sorts of people are even more so formulating their economic theory in line with their politics. And I think it's very ironic they then turn around and accuse others of doing this, but probably not ironic.
Sure. I was just pointing to the fact that it is not. It wouldn't take you much to go from, let's say, Robinson's political beliefs contributed to the idea, at least fleshed it out a bit more, that the idea that social power is an important determinant of what you call the shared capital shares, relative to similarly the Americans' a sort of asocial approach, which derived from politics, leading them to make a certain theoretical assumption.
Yes, but again, as I said about the American position, I think you have to understand that in the context of American politics, and in the context of was and Pierre Strafford's criticisms politically motivated. I'm really less.
I would say they were politically motivated as much as politically inspired. I'm not sure quite how to put this.
I think maybe they had from the system.
I'm definitely not saying that just
because they were against it. So that gave them more of a. That may have given them more of a scope to think outside the box. But I really don't believe that you can find anything in Robinson or Strafford's technical work that you can call politically motivated.
Yeah.
While you can find a lot of things from the technical work of the mainstream, which you can only be being politically motivated.
So I suppose I'm drawing it. I would say that even if you're not a communist, you can get behind. Even if you're not a social democrat, if you're a centre right, you can get behind what Robinson and Straffa were saying. But the fact that they were communist had some contribution to their emphasis of social power.
Yeah, I mean, maybe, but it couldn't have been.
Yeah.
I mean, because so many social scientists and historians and everybody understands the social power plays as well. I mean, to deny it is just to be stupid, ignorant in a lot of ways. And I sort of sympathize with what you're saying, but on the other hand, I just think it's such an obvious point that we don't even need to attribute motivation to why they had to point it out.
Right, but then if you can say that it might be widespread academically, but in the American academic consciousness, which derives from a central American, I mean, the idea that social power influences the economy in important ways gives you a lot of headway in many arguments, right? Which is profitable to the left wing.
Yes. Well, I'd put it differently, and this is kind of the line of attack I'm taking in my book. What such an argument does is it takes away the aura of neutrality that's put on economic arguments.
There we go.
Yes, that is important. Economists in the US especially today see themselves as making proclamations based on some sort of technocratic, objective, scientific, whatever you want to call it, position of authority. Now, again, in my book, I argue in order to understand this, you again have to understand something about American politics, and people have to understand, especially people outside of the US, that American politics is the American state, the American government is a revolutionary government, right? Like France, like where I'm from, like Ireland, they're revolutionary states. They were formed through an explicit social revolution and through a war. And while France fell back on a system of effective monarchy under Napoleon III and so forth, the US maintained its revolutionary roots, as to a large extent it's Ireland. And
when you say revolution here, we have to emphasize it's revolution in the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment.
Yes, but yes, but I'm just making a more general case that the idea of the state in America is a revolutionary idea. For example, you're not living in the UK right now, but I assume you grew up there. I've been living here for 2 years, and the UK conception of the state is a very unrevolutionary conception of the state, because it is not a revolutionary state. No. It makes for a completely different type of political discourse in a lot of ways.
Sure.
And in the US, a very strong populist undercurrent to politics in the US, which has never gone away. It's been there since just after the revolution in the Whiskey Rebellion and so forth. And it's very, very problematic for the American political elite, because the American people have revolutionary sentiments after so long that other nations do not possess. As I said, Ireland is a revolutionary state, but for various historical reasons that really no longer exists in Ireland. France like to think they have a very revolutionary consciousness, but I personally think it's a little false. America has a very real one, and it manifests as very broad populism, which you see from both the right and the left. You see it in the likes of Elizabeth Warren on the left. You also see it in the likes of the Tea Party. And American politics, you can read American politics, especially in the 20th century, as being a means by which to steer and control this populist tendency, which makes it very difficult to govern in the US. It really does. I don't think we should diminish this. This isn't me saying that the populists are right and the evil technocrats are wrong. it's a problem for how the American system of governance works. And I think this is what people like Noam Chomsky and so forth are talking about when they're talking about manufacturing consent, when they're talking about these public relations guys rising up around Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann and these kind of people who effectively articulated this new system of governance that was put in place in the US. Chomsky reads this as sort of some sort of capitalist tendency or something like that. I think that's slightly misleading. This is in particular how America has tried to deal with the revolutionary underpinnings of their state. How do you govern a state that is a revolutionary state, that is perpetually seen as a revolutionary state? That's a really difficult problem. And this manufacturing of consent, as it were, seems to have been how the Americans have come to terms with it. And part of what happened, especially after the Second World War, is they began to try and form sort of technocratic solutions to problems. And American Keynesianism, this is what American Keynesianism is. It's something that pretends to be a neutral science. And it serves the American purpose in that sense, in that they are scared of people, the American elite are scared of people like today Elizabeth Warren. There are many figures in the past, after the war, so forth, Roosevelt to a large extent. Those people terrify them because they can easily stir up a sentiment among the American people that will always be there. So, for example, if we get similar rhetoric that we see from Elizabeth Warren in Ireland today, or if you get somebody who's saying something similar in the UK, it will not chime with the vast majority of the population. The population will see them as sort of troublemakers and so forth, right? And they will not get sufficient votes. If somebody like Elizabeth Warren got a very large-scale platform, as she seems to be building at the moment, what she's saying appeals to almost every American. It sounds really nice to people over there because they sort of have an anti-elitist streak that just do not exist in most other Western countries. And so I think you have to understand what the whole neo-Keynesian thing is and in those terms. And also what monetarism was as well. It's the idea that we can form this sort of neutral system and we can set targets and so forth. And what this allows to be done is for political projects to be carried out by people who aren't saying they're carrying out political projects. So it allows for example, the monetarist policies. Paul Volcker actually said in an interview a few years ago that he never believed in monetarism, but that he used it as an excuse to generate the Reagan recession, which helped bring down the inflation, crush the unions and so forth. So they know what they're doing. People aren't stupid, but the people at the helm know what they're doing. They know that they're manipulating this technocratic language in order to put together political projects that otherwise they wouldn't want to explicitly articulate. Whereas, again, in other countries like the UK or anywhere else, if somebody's going to undertake these policies, a lot of the time they will explicitly articulate it. Thatcher, for example, although she did take on the sort of technocratic language of monetarism from time to time, her main thrust was really quite political, and she was quite clear on what she was doing. Reagan wasn't as clear. He was appealing to vague populist sentiments and then allowing his economic advisors to engage in this sort of weird technocratic thing. So I think that has to be really, really, really firmly understood. And so what the likes of Robinson, they're opening up that door, and they're saying, well, if we conceive of economics as having a basically political underlining, then we can no longer be the guy in the lab coat next to the policymaker making objective decisions. Yeah. And that is very, very, very offensive to American academic opinion.
I would
because those academics are tied into the system which Chomsky might say manufactures consent.
No, I mean I would sort of say that the technocratic point is correct, but I suppose the general trend you're pointing to in terms of technocracy as a suppression of populism can be interpreted as the general rise of social democracy after the the Depression. I mean, it is true that in American political culture, populism is is the main factor to some extent, but to a large extent. But the rise of monetarist controls and Keynesian economic management in the 60s and the 80s deal with sort of a pan-Western belief in the possibility of science and technocracy to lead us to a better tomorrow.
Yeah, no, I'm certainly not denying that. But what I am saying is that America has found it more necessary to deploy that narrative than other Western democracies. Other Western democracies are fairly content to talk about politics in political terms. The American elite do not like to discuss it in terms. So I agree with you. It's a tendency that exists across the West, but it's one that if we could call this the dogma of the day, what I'm trying to say is that the Americans need that dogma more. And the reason for that has its roots in the revolutionary constitution of their state and the massive support for underlying populism that exists within their population, which literally well over 50% of the population in America, I would say, would be seduced by populist rhetoric, whereas you're talking about minimum percentages outside of crisis times in every other European country. I mean, for example, Greece is now about to vote in what I call a populist party in the form of Syriza, right? But only in times of crisis. No way.
Outside of crisis. Yeah, I see what you mean. I don't know. I just suppose that I've always thought about it in terms of the Depression having more of a numerical effect on the development of the welfare state, and the comparative technocratization deals with the collapse. The collapse, the Depression was more severe in the United States than it was in, let's say, the UK and France, rather than, I mean, I suppose in Germany it was pretty severe, but in the US and Germany were certainly the most severe in Western Europe. So I was thinking the American political reaction doesn't just end with Roosevelt, it ends with the development of technocracy and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I'm not really contesting any of that. I'm just saying that they needed the language, or what I call dogma of technocracy, more than the other states, because when the other states were developing their post-war economies, they could couch those developments in political terms. I mean, they really were saying we're moving toward social democracy, socialism, or away from it, or whatever. You know, the Germans were moving toward ordoliberalism and so forth. They could put those in really political terms, and I think the Americans found themselves unable to do this. Again, this ties back into what I'm talking about, the self-identity of the likes of Solov and Samuels, that they couldn't, that they needed this sort of lab coat ideology to hide their political opinion.
I suppose on a final note, I'll just discuss this little quote from Brad DeLong's recent article against Bob Skidelsky's criticism of mainstream economics. I'm not sure you've seen it.
Oh, I did. I saw that yesterday.
Oh, yeah, on the INET website. There's a pretty key paragraph. I think that modern neoclassical economics is in fine shape, as long as it is understood as the ideological and substantive legitimating doctrine of the political theory of possessive individualism. As long as we have relatively self-interested liberal individuals who have relatively strong beliefs that things are theirs, the competitive market in equilibrium is an absolutely wonderful mechanism for achieving truly extraordinary degrees of societal coordination and productivity. We need to understand that, we need to value that, and that is what neoclassical economics does, and does well.
But isn't that exactly what I'm saying? Yeah. How loaded with politics is that statement? I mean, if you compare
he's kind of said it outright, hasn't he? It is in fine shape as it is understood as the ideological and substantive legitimating doctrine of the political theory of possessive individualism.
you can't put it better. And if I know you don't want to read through it now, and you'd have to read through the whole article to prove my point. But if anyone that's listening wants to go and read the article that DeLong is responding to, Skidelsky does not really. He's talking about something entirely different from political ideology. He's talking about how he does. I think he talks about ideology in his article, but it's more so an idea that the mainstream economics is sort of a fog or whatever, you know, and it throws up dust. Skidelsky is not. You'd think from that response that Skidelsky was calling explicitly for some sort of collectivism, right? Mm-hmm. So what is it in Skidelsky's criticisms of mainstream economics that provoke somebody like DeLong to begin speaking in terms that are quite explicitly political? And this is exactly what I'm getting at, that the guys that are doing them, it's them that are trying to ideologize. Again, we have to point out, like, obviously I'm trying as hard as I can not to say anything that reflects on what I think or whatever. But to be absolutely frank, I don't necessarily disagree that much with DeLong. That is a rare statement to make, but I don't have a huge problem with, generally speaking, the market system and so on. But what I do have a problem is people masking the defense of that system in technocratic terms. It's really disingenuous. It's really disingenuous to go around teaching students something, and because you're brainwashing people, right? I mean, if a student wants to be a communist or something like that, that's up to them. That's not up to you. You can't sell, what is it DeLong calls it, the legitimating ideology of
possessive individualism
as some sort of objective. Right, you can't sell that to somebody as an objective sign. Like that's propaganda. That is brainwashing. That is literally brainwashing. So you can lay out, you can try and evacuate all that crap from economics, try and teach economics objectively, and then you can try in the seminar afterwards to convince a student that your political ideology is correct through persuasion. Mm-hmm. It is not legitimate to go around trumpeting a doctrine that DeLong is quite explicitly saying is political, and then pretending it's not. And then what? How long is it going to be until DeLong comes out with another argument doing what Krugman does and saying that, oh, it's us that are doing the politics, you heterodox guys? I mean, how long? Just wait for it. It'll come. And then it's like, but hang on a minute, here you said that this is a legitimating doctrine for a form of political ideology, and now you're saying that we're the ones engaged in, like, this is where we're going with this debate, and frankly, DeLong and Krugman are going to lose it, because they're on the losing side, and it's becoming increasingly manifest what they're doing, and people don't like what they're doing, and the student movement is a reflection of that, because the student movement know that something's saying.
Mm-hmm. Sure.